this week on Tuesday morning, I was up in my office at home, and I was working on this message for this morning, working on the sermon for this morning. And I was really, just to be honest, I was really down. It was one of those, I don't know, maybe you have, there's this an old joke about preachers. In fact, Dr. Deloach is the one that talked about it often, and of course he went home to be with the Lord recently, but people would ask him, people would ask him, Jim, do you ever feel like quitting? And after he'd preached, he'd say, yes, every Monday. And I think a lot of preachers feel that way. Every Monday, it's time to quit. And so you have that feeling, you've preached, and you go, well, this week it was Tuesday for me, and I was just down. I won't say depressed, but it was borderline that. And for a couple of hours in my office, I sat there, and when I study at home, I have a big monitor that I work with, and my computer's here, and I just pop up this little plastic table that's, I don't know, 4 or 5 feet long, and I set it to my right, and I have my Bible there and all kind of books, and I had them all there, and I had some commentaries printed out, and I had at least one other book, maybe others that were open, and so this whole desk is filled with my sermon prep for this week, and my computer's here with stuff on the computer, and on one of those sheets, I have 4 or 5 or 6 different names of people in our church family and other people I know that are on my list of people that I'm praying for, and I'm thinking about these people. And for the better part of 2 hours, I sat there in this fog, just depressed, not accomplishing anything, and spread out right in front of me was the life and the story of Joseph. It was in my clear physical vision, but I didn't see it. A friend of mine called me, one of my pastor friends called me, we talked for a moment. I was honest with him about where I was at that moment. We talked, and he prayed for me, and we looked at, finally that call was over, and finally at some point in the morning, I looked, and when I focused and saw what was in front of me on that desk in the life of Joseph, and I saw how God worked in his life, it kind of lifted me out of that fog of that couple of hours that I sat there and kind of wallowed in. Remember, Joseph was sent by his father to go find his brothers. We talked about him last week, to go back and check on his brothers to see how they were doing. And remember, his brothers hated him. They're a little bit like the 2 teenage girls I read about this week. There were 2 teenage girls in a certain high school, and a new girl moved into their school. And one of the girls asked her friend, what do you think about the new girl? And the girl said, well, I think she's sweet, and I think she's smart, and I think she's cute. And her friend said, yeah, you're right. I can't stand her either. That's kind of the way Joseph's brothers felt about him. They couldn't stand him, and they hated him. And if you remember, it just so happened that when Jacob sent Joseph to find his brothers, it just so happened when he's wandering around in that field near Shechem and couldn't find them, a man saw him and wandering around and said, what are you doing? He said, I'm looking for my brothers. And it just so happened that man had happened to overhear that they were going up to Dothan, and it just so happened that when Joseph went and found them, those brothers that hated him, threw him in that pit. But it just so happened, while he's in that pit, just so happened that caravan came by, headed toward Egypt, and they sold him to those people. And it just so happened when they got to Egypt, just so happened that he was sold to a man named Potiphar. And he rose to run Potiphar's house because God was so with Joseph. And it just so happened that Mrs. Potiphar had eyes for Joseph and accused him of something he did not do. Just so happened he ended up in prison, and it just so happened that God's hand was with him, we saw last week, in prison. And he rose to run that prison for the prison keeper. He so trusted Joseph, it just so happened he rose to run the whole prison. And it just so happened that while he was there, and we'll pick up the story from last week right here, it just so happened that the king threw his cupbearer and his baker into that prison. Just so happened. And while they're there, and Joseph is in charge of that prison, and we pick up right there this week that the cupbearer and the baker both have dreams. And they're both troubled by the dreams. They don't know what they mean. And they come to Joseph. And Joseph can see something's going on with him. He notices. Now, picture this. Joseph has been so mistreated. He's been so abused and forgotten and stepped on. But yet he's in this prison through no fault of his own, but he notices these guys are troubled. He notices it. And he says, guys, what's the problem? Why the long face? And they tell him their dreams. And he says, aren't dreams God's to interpret, and he interprets the dreams. He tells the cupbearer, your dream means this. Your dream means that in 3 days, you're going to be restored to your old position, and you're going to be the cupbearer for the king, Pharaoh, once again. And so now the baker's encouraged by that. What about my dream? What about my dream? Well, different story. Your dream is in 3 days, you're going to be let out of this place too, but you're going to be hung. You're not going to make it. Well, that wasn't such a good deal. But here's the reality. The reality is when he told the cupbearer that you're going to be restored to your position, he said to him, remember me when it goes well for you. But 2 more years pass. This happens. Both those things happen. But the cupbearer forgets Joseph, and 2 more years pass while he's in prison. In Genesis 40, verse 23, it says, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Now, do you notice that all along the way, Joseph hasn't just sat by and sulked and just had his own little pity party when things happen to him when he's mistreated? Instead, he seemed to do just the opposite. He seemed to use these moments as a springboard for the next thing that God has for his life, for bigger and better things. If when his brothers sold him into slavery, he would have sat around and just thought about, how can I get back at my brothers? How can I get vengeance from my brothers? He would have never become the head steward in Potiphar's house. Never would have happened. And when he was falsely accused by Mrs. P of trying to do something he did not do, he would have never made it in prison to rise to be in charge of that prison. And if he had just sulked there, and when the cupbearer, when he interpreted his dream, and he gets out, and 2 years pass, 2 more. Now, don't let that just zip by you when you're telling this story. This is 2 real years. 2 more years in prison because he's forgotten. And if he would have just been sitting there upset with that cupbearer all this time, he would not have been ready to respond the way God had him respond when the next event takes place that God brings into his life. And in a real sense, the first point I want to make today is a reinforcement of all that we looked at last week in Joseph's life. It's this: when life brings you unfair things, and it will, for all of us, for you, for me, for all of us, life will bring us what appears to be unfair things. We have to resist the temptation to become cynical toward people. Someone treats you unfairly, something happens here, there's some event in life, it becomes so easy to become cynical toward people. Joseph did not. You see it all the way through his life. I think God speaks to you and me today. He says, you resist that temptation to become cynical toward people. It's so easy to do. Now, let's continue right here with Joseph's his life is remarkable. It's absolutely remarkable. Now, all along the way, Joseph has a vision. I'll just be honest, I don't have it in my life. Not anywhere close to the way Joseph did, and I'm just going to go out on a limb and say most of you don't either. His vision was amazing. And I want you to think about his vision as we walk through this passage and walk through his story today. So 2 full years go by. The cupbearer has forgotten him, and now Pharaoh has a dream. Pharaoh has a dream, and none of his guys can interpret it. None of his wise men know what the dreams, actually it's 2 dreams. None of them know what the dreams mean. And finally, the cupbearer remembers. Oh, Pharaoh, there's this Hebrew guy in prison, and I had a dream. The baker had a dream. He interpreted both of our dreams. I bet he can interpret your dreams. And so Pharaoh calls for him. And I love it. I love how the Bible talks about this. They clean Joseph up. Now, who knows what it's like in this prison, but it says they go and he shaves. He probably feels better than he's felt in years right now. He gets a clean shave. They clean him up. And he comes before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh tells Joseph his dreams. Here are the 2 dreams Pharaoh has. The first dream is this. Pharaoh says, I'm standing on the edge of the Nile, and I see these 7 cows come out of the Nile River, and they begin to feed on the marsh grasses. And these are big, fat, healthy cows. They look good. Big, fat, healthy cows. And then I see 7 more cows come up. They're scrawny, they're skinny, they're sickly looking. And these 7 scrawny, skinny, thin cows eat the big, fat, 7 healthy cows. But after they eat them, they still look like scrawny, thin, unhealthy, sickly cows. And then I woke up. And then I had another dream. And my next dream was I saw these 7 heads of grain. They were full and they were beautiful. And then I saw 7 more heads of grain, and they were shriveled and withered, and these 7 shriveled, withered heads of grain ate the big, plump, beautiful heads of grain, but they still looked shriveled and withered. And I told these dreams to my magicians. I told them to all my guys, and none of them could tell me what the dreams meant. And Joseph gives Pharaoh God's answer. Listen to what he says. Joseph responded, both of Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. Now listen to what he says. God is telling Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. And then he interprets the dreams. He says the seven healthy, fat cows and those 7 heads of grain that look so good, they're a time of real prosperity. I guess in today's culture we'd say it was going to be a huge prosperity. It's a big prosperity. Just saying. But the seven sickly cows, the 7 withered heads of grain, they're a time of unbelievable famine. In fact, the famine's going to be so great that you won't even remember the 7 years of prosperity. And then Joseph does something Pharaoh didn't ask for. He interprets the dreams. He tells him what's going to happen. There's going to be 7 years of great prosperity. There's going to be 7 years of great famine. And then Joseph continues, which Pharaoh didn't ask him for any advice beyond that. But Joseph continues. He says, therefore Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh should appoint supervisors over the land, then let them collect 1/5 of all the crops during the 7 good years. Have them gather all the food produced in the good years that are just ahead and bring it to Pharaoh's storehouses. Store it away and guard it so there will be food in the cities. That way there will be enough during the 7 years and the land won't be ruined. That was impressive. That was an impressive thing for him to give Pharaoh. This is how you need to deal with this situation. And Joseph never said to Pharaoh, God is with me, or the Spirit of God is on me. But listen to Pharaoh's response. He saw it. So Pharaoh asked his officials, can we find anyone else like this man so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Now think about that. Think about where Joseph has been. From the pit to being sold into slavery, to be sold to Potiphar, to being in prison these years. Now here's Pharaoh, because Joseph interprets these dreams, saying, you are, in all the land, you are number 2. There's no one over you except me. Now you get a picture for that. You see what God has done in his life. And just like Joseph said, these were followed with 7 great years of prosperity. And then the famine begins, the 7 years of famine, just as he said. And this is what happens, because famine is not just in Egypt, but it's in the countries all around. Verse 57 says, and people from all around came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe throughout the world. And the story moves forward, and God's purposes continue to unfold. Now stay with me, because I want to walk through the rest of this story of Joseph. And how God brought his children to Israel. Remember, we've been reading all about I hope you're still doing your reading in your chronological Bible. And we're reading right now that they're about to enter the promised land. We're right on the threshold after the 40 years of wandering. This is how the family got there. This is how the Israelites ended up in Egypt in the first place. So the story unfolds. Jacob's back at home. He's in Canaan. There's a famine there. And he tells his sons, you go down to Egypt and buy us some grain, so we don't starve to death. And so he sends his 10 older sons. He doesn't let Benjamin go. Benjamin, remember, is Joseph's blood brother, the only one that he has, is born to his mom from his dad. And he's the younger one, and Jacob won't let him go down. Since Joseph was the governor of Egypt, his brothers head down, the 10 brothers show up, and now they're in front of Joseph. Verse 6 of chapter 42 says, I love this, and as this says it over and over in the story, they bowed before him. I love that. I love it because we had the dreams from when he was a child we talked about last week about the sheaves. Remember bowing before him? Are we going to bow before you? And about the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowing before him? And here's the first instance of it. They bowed before him. And Joseph recognized his brothers. But his brothers didn't recognize him. How could they? He's speaking a different language to them. He doesn't speak to them in their own language. They would not be expecting their brother to be the governor of all of Egypt, but that's the picture. And so he pretended to be a stranger. And he spoke harshly to them, and he accused them of being spies, being there to check out the land. And this is his brother's response to him when he accuses them of being spies. And of course, he knows who they are. They said, no. We are honest men, sir. We're not spies. And he says, yes, you are. You've come to check out our land. Now, I love this next passage. Put yourself in Joseph's shoes as he's hearing this. Sir, they said, there are actually 12 of us. We're your servants. They're all your brothers, sons of a man living in the land of Canaan. Our youngest brother is back with our father right now, and one of our brothers is no longer with us. Really? Just, can you see this? And I wonder if Joseph thought, oh yeah, he is. You know, Scripture doesn't tell us that, but you got to wonder. But Joseph said, no, you're spies. This is how I'm going to test you. I'm going to lock you all up, and I'm going to send one of you go, and this one can go get your younger brother and bring him back, and when I see your younger brother, then I'll know you're telling the truth and you're not spies. So he throws them all in prison, all in jail for 3 days. All of them are there. Now, in the course of time, he changes his mind, and he determines to test them this way. He says, if you're really honest men, this is after 3 days. By the way, I think he chooses to let 9 of the 10 go back and keep the other ones just to take food home to their father, and Scripture kind of says that as well. But he says, you choose one of your brothers to remain in prison. The rest of you go home with grain for your starving families, but you must bring your younger brother back to me. This will prove that you're telling the truth. And so they all agreed. Now I love this. This is a passage I read to you last week that when Joseph was in the pit, you don't hear this part of the story, but this is where they say right here, clearly, and they don't know that Joseph can understand them, but they're saying, clearly we're being punished because of what we did to Joseph long ago. We saw his anguish when he pleaded for his life, but we wouldn't listen. That's why we're in trouble right now. Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But he understood them, and he turned away, and he began to cry, and he composed himself, and then he turned back to them. And then Joseph chooses Simeon to stay. Simeon's the one that's going to stay while the other 9 brothers go back. And so he ordered the servants to fill their bags with as much grain as they could carry on their donkeys so they could go back. And then he ordered them to put the money back in the top of their sacks. Now, they had separate bags to feed the donkeys and for their supplies along the way to go back home to Canaan. But he put the money back in their sacks. And so the brothers leave, Simeon stays, and he's going to stay until Benjamin is brought back. And they head for home, but the first night they open their sacks and they see the money. This one brother sees the money in his sack, and they're all distraught. He found the money, and it says, Scripture says their hearts sank. And how are we going to describe this one to this governor? And he's going to think we've stole our money, taken our money back, and they're scared to death. They get home and they tell Jacob the whole story. They're back in the land of Canaan. They tell him what happened. They tell him, this governor, we went before him. He accused us of being spies. No, we're 12 brothers. And we told him we had a dad and a little brother back at home. And they said, you got to bring your little brother back. Because they kept Simeon their dad. And unless we take Benjamin back, we can't get Simeon out. His dad said, no, you can't take him back. Verse 36, when this happened, Jacob exclaimed, you're robbing me of my children. Joseph is gone. Simeon is gone. He's the one back in prison. And now you want to take Benjamin too? Everything is going against me. Wah. Do you see the contrast in Jacob's response to life and Joseph's? What different vision they have for life and what's going on. Reuben stepped up and said, hey, I'll be responsible. Dad, I'll be responsible. Put it on me and my sons if I don't bring him back. But Jacob wouldn't hear it. And he said, no, you're not going back. Not going to do it. So Simeon's left there. But when the grain begins to run out, we don't know exactly how much time passes, but a little bit of time does. And when the grain begins to run out, he tells his sons, hey, I want you to go back to Egypt and get us some more grain. And the brothers won't do it unless they can take Benjamin. They say, if you send Benjamin with us, we'll go down and buy more food. But if you don't let Benjamin go, we won't go either. Remember, the man said, you will not see my face if your little brother doesn't come back. And so they know they won't even see Joseph unless they bring Benjamin with them. So finally, Jacob agrees. And so the brothers pack all of their stuff and all the gifts, all the money that was returned to them, plus money again to buy more. So double the money they pack, plus gifts that Jacob sends back to the governor again. And they arrive, and Joseph sees Benjamin, and he tells his people, prepare a feast, go slaughter an animal, prepare a feast. These men will eat with me at my place at noon. And so they usher the brothers into Joseph's palace. I think it's interesting, Joseph's in a palace now. And the brothers are terrified, Scripture says. They're terrified in this moment. And they're thinking to themselves, it's because of the money. Because the money, somebody put the money back in our bags. They think we stole from them. We're going to be slaves. We're in trouble. He's going to seize us. He's going to get us. When Joseph came in, they gave him their gifts. And then it says again, they bowed low to the ground before him. I like it. That's at least the second time that we know of. And he said he had inquired about their father. How's the old man? He didn't call his father an old man. He said, how is the old man you told me about, your father? And they said, he's fine. And then they bowed low again. They bowed before him again. That's at least the third time. Then Joseph looked at his brother Benjamin and said, is this your younger brother you told me about? They said, yes. And Joseph said to Benjamin, may God be gracious to you, my son. And then Joseph, it's all he could handle. He ran out of the room, ran to his private room, and he just lost it. Emotionally lost it, and I'm sure he cried there for a while. And the Scripture says he washed his face, and he came back in to his brothers. And Joseph had his brothers sit down for the meal. Now, this had to just freak him out, because he sits the 12 brothers in order of their age. He knows the age of everyone, and how would he know this? But and they're like, it's like freaking him out that he knows how to set them in the order of their age. And it says, then they began to feast, and they feasted and they drank freely. And then Joseph gave these instructions. It's time for them to leave. And he says, you fill their bags with as much as they can carry. Fill them to the brim. And put their money back. Put all their money back in the top of their bags. And then in the youngest boy's bag, put my silver cup that I drink from. And so they put in Benjamin's bag that silver cup, and they let them go. They leave, having no idea this is Joseph. And they don't get very far, and then Joseph sends his men after him. And he says, you go get them, and you find the one whose silver cup is in his bag, and bring them back here. And they stop the brothers, and the brothers have no clue. And they said, why did you guys respond this way? Why did you steal the governor's silver cup? Well, we didn't do that. And if that happened, if one of us did that, kill that person, and the rest of us will be your slaves. And he said, well, that's unfair, but the one will come back and be the slave that does it. And they began to look in the bags, and there is the silver cup in Benjamin's bag. And the brothers tore their clothes, and they were broken. They take him back to Joseph. And they fall down before him. And once again, they fell to the ground before him. That's at least the fourth time, by the way, now they've bowed before their brother. And Judah said this, oh, my Lord, what can we say to you? How do we prove our innocence? We didn't do this. We don't know how this happened. Take us all, we'll all be your slaves. And Joseph said, I wouldn't do such a thing. Just the one who had the cup. Just him, just that one will be my slave. And now one of the brothers speaks up for the first time and really comes to the aid of his brother. And Judah steps up and says, so please, my Lord, let me stay here as a slave instead of the boy. And let the boy return with his brothers. For how can I return to my father if the boy is not with me? I couldn't bear to see the anguish this would cause my father. At this point, Joseph has had all he can handle. He's ready to burst, I'm sure. And now he tells his brothers. Can you imagine this moment when he says to them, and probably for the first time speaks to them in their language, I am Joseph. Can you imagine? Can you imagine how they felt in that moment? It says, but his brothers were speechless. You think? They were stunned to realize this was Joseph. But listen to what he says to them. But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves. For selling me to this place, it was God who sent me ahead of you to preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years. And there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. This is just the second year of the famine. There's 5 more to go. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive. And he is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace, and the governor of Egypt. Hurry back and get my father Jacob, and bring him back here and live in Goshen. He says, God sent me here. God sent me ahead of you. God made me second in command to Pharaoh. God's the one who made me the governor of Egypt. Here's the second point in all this. You look at Joseph's life. When life seems so unfair, resist the temptation to be cynical toward God. What if Joseph had been cynical toward God? When he knew that he was unjustly thrown in the pit and unjustly sold to this caravan and unjustly sold to Potiphar and unjustly thrown in prison and unjustly left there for 2 more years. When all that's going on in his life, what if Joseph had become cynical toward God? How would it have changed his life and changed the future of all these people? But God used him in his obedience to him. When life seems so unfair, and it will at times in our lives, when we grapple with things like this, we're much better off trusting God instead of resisting God and becoming cynical toward him, but to lay ourselves at his feet and to trust him. Joseph's life just screams of this. I like how one person said this. They said, we have a tendency to typecast God. Do you ever have a tendency to typecast God? To decide for ourselves how he should work in our lives. We determine what we want to do, how we want to live, with whom we want to relate. Then we take our plan to God for his approval. And whenever our plans don't work out, we cry out in despair, where is God? Do you see how off that is? From Joseph, we can learn that God is right alongside of us, walking with us, fulfilling his purposes in our lives. Joseph kept his vision. His focus was on God all along the way. How do we know? Listen to some of the things he said in his life. He said to Potiphar's wife, how can I do this great evil and sin against God? It was about God. To the cupbearer and baker, do not interpretations belong to God? To Pharaoh, it's not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. To his brothers, you did not send me here. God did it. And so Jacob and his entire family leave Canaan, and they come to Egypt for 5 more years of the famine, where they'll be cared for there in Goshen. You see how God brings his whole family and fulfills his purposes and his prophecy that all of Israel is going to be there in Egypt. And we know the story we've been reading that continues after that. This is how they got there. The problem for the brothers was Jacob died. Down the road, Jacob died. And when Jacob dies, they're freaked out again, because they think Joseph's just been waiting for the death of their father to have his vengeance against them. And so once again, it says, and they fall down before him. So they bow before him for at least the 5th time now. And they say to him, we're your slaves. And one more time, Joseph shows he has a whole different kind of vision than most of us. A whole different vision than I do, certainly. Maybe not than you. Genesis chapter 50, but Joseph replied, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? And then in verse 20, you intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. No, don't be afraid. I will continue to take care of you and your children. So he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. Joseph had 50-20 vision. Now, he couldn't see from 50 feet what most of us see from 20 feet, not that kind of vision. He had a whole lot greater vision than that. See, he could see through life. He could see throughout his life when things seemed so unfair. Joseph could see that God's hand was in all the things that were going on. A much greater vision than 50-20. He could see things and understood by faith that God was doing a work in his life when life just didn't seem right. We need God's grace. You need it, I need it. We need God's grace in our life when these unfair events are taking place, so we don't become cynical toward people, and we certainly don't become cynical toward God and waste our time and our lives in this cynicism. Here's the bottom line for the story today. Just like it was for me on Tuesday, I'm sitting here at my computer, I'm sitting here with all this laid out on my desk. The whole story was laid out on my desk, and I wasn't seeing it. Today, God's laid out the story for all of us, the story of Joseph's life. It's in front of you. It's in front of me. Do you see it? Because God calls you and me to have 50-20 vision too. To be able to look at life and say, when it seems so unfair, the world might mean it for evil, the world might mean it to harm you, but God meant it for good. And God is at work in your life and in my life, fulfilling his purposes. We see it so clearly in the life of Joseph. We talk about it in the New Testament as well. We talk about it a lot. We quote the verse a lot, but it's true. Romans 8:28 says, and we know that all things, God causes all things to work together for good. It doesn't say all things are good. Not all things are good. Bad things happen in my life. Bad things happen in your life. But we know that God causes all things to work together for good, but not for everybody. Listen, to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. You love God today and you're called according to his purpose. Even the things that come and that God allows to come into our lives that seem so unfair, and they're there for all of us, God will take them and use them to fulfill his purposes and his plans in your life and in my life. So I would say to all of us today, what God is calling us to do is put on some new glasses. Glasses that give us 50-20 vision. Glasses of faith that say, God, I trust you. In spite of the things that seem so unfair in life, and there's a lot it seems like. The world might intend them for evil, but God, you mean them for good, to fulfill his purposes, to bring him glory, and to conform you and me to the image of his son, Jesus Christ. That's the next verse, by the way, in Romans 8. Because those he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his son. God is at work in your life and in my life, if we know him, to make us more like Jesus. And he'll use these events in our lives. May he give us the vision of Joseph, 50-20 vision.